Welcome, everyone. I appreciate both of our witnesses being here today for this important hearing to receive testimony on the oversight of Task Force for Business and Stability Operations in Afghanistan. This is a hearing of the Subcommittee on Readiness and Management Support. I want to thank, first of all, my ranking member, Senator Kaine, for joining me in leading this subcommittee and for his hard work every day on behalf of our service members and their family. And I look forward to the work we'll do together this year. We begin the subcommittee's first hearing of the year to receive testimony on the Task Force for Business and Stability Operations, TFBSO, projects in Afghanistan. We are joined this afternoon by Secretary Brian McEwen, the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as well as Mr. John F. Sobko, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. I want to thank each of you for your willingness to testify today and for your dedicated service to our country. TFBSO was a Department of Defense task force created to address economic revitalization efforts in Iraq. And then in early 2010, TFBSO began operations in Afghanistan. The goals of TFBSO in Afghanistan were to reduce violence and enhance stability and support economic normalcy for Afghanistan. The task force sought to, 1, restore productive economic capacity, 2, stimulate economic growth, and 3, serve as a catalyst for international investment in Afghanistan. In order to support these goals, according to SIGAR, more than $820 million was appropriated since FY 2009 for TFBSO programs and operations in Afghanistan. Of that $820 million, about $759 million was obligated and $638 million were dispersed for the task force's operations and activities in Afghanistan. The real purpose of today's hearing is to determine, foremost, whether these resources were spent wisely and properly, and whether measurable results were achieved from the hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent on Task Force TFBSO. SIGAR has published a number of reports and inquiries on this task force, and I'm going to briefly touch on them. First, in July of 2014, SIGAR released an inspection report about a cold and dry storage facility which cost TFBSO nearly $3 million for this facility to store local produce, provide a location for sorting and packaging of produce, and serve as a transit point for trucks. According to SIGAR's report in July of 2014, it has never been used and is not being maintained. In April of 2015, SIGAR released the first report about TFBSO and USAID extractive projects. This report identified a lack of a clear and cohesive development strategy by TFBSO, and that TFBSO had not improved interagency coordination subsequent to issues that were identified by the GAO as a weakness in 2011 when it evaluated this issue. In October of 2015, SIGAR released a special projects report about TFBSO's compressed natural gas filling station project, which TFBSO paid $43 million in direct and overhead costs to construct, according to a number originally provided by the DOD to the SIGAR, and was not subsequently disputed until we received Mr. McEwen's testimony recently. A somewhat similar facility in Pakistan, according to SIGAR, would only cost between $200,000 or $500,000 to build. In November of 2015, SIGAR sent an inquiry to DOD questioning the expenditure of $150 million, nearly 20% of its total budget, for villas and associated armed security. SIGAR found that TFBSO could have saved tens of millions of taxpayer dollars if TFBSO members had lived at existing DOD facilities, bases existing in Afghanistan. And then most recently, in January of 2016, SIGAR released an audit report on TFBSO's and USAID's efforts to assist Afghanistan's oil, gas, and mineral industries. The report found 8 of the 11 TFBSO extractive projects worth $175 million of the total $215 million dispersed either had little to no or partial project achievement. Further, not a single project was transitioned to the Department of State or USAID when the TFBSO task force ceased operations in Afghanistan. The totality of these reports and some of the conclusions reached in a RAND report that was actually commissioned by TFBSO itself raised very serious questions about how the money that was appropriated by Congress for TFBSO and its work in Afghanistan was spent and whether this money was wasted. SIGAR concluded that TFBSO generally has not delivered on its stated goals. SIGAR has received more, according to SIGAR, they have received more complaints of waste, fraud, and abuse relating to TFBSO activities than for any other organization operating in Afghanistan. These questions have been exacerbated by the failure of the Department of Defense to respond to SIGAR's legitimate questions. TFBSO ended its programs in Afghanistan in December of 2014, and the task force ceased operations in March of 2015. One of the most troubling aspects of this task force and DOD's oversight is that on multiple occasions, SIGAR asked DOD to answer questions about this task force, including about the compressed natural gas station, as early as May of 2015, only several months after, actually at that point, 2 months after the task force ceased. Yet DOD repeatedly failed to provide documents, claiming the department no longer possessed the personnel expertise to address these questions. These assertions were made repeatedly despite the fact that members of TFBSO were still working for DOD, and the former acting director of TFBSO worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense beginning in June. In fact, a hard drive of over 100 gigabytes of documents was just recently made available to SIGAR only last week. In Secretary McEwen's testimony today, DOD disputes SIGAR's numbers on what the compressed natural gas station cost. According to SIGAR, DOD actually gave this number to a company called Vestige, the $43 million figure that was contracted by DOD, which in turn provided this information to SIGAR. And it's notable that when the draft report was issued by SIGAR on the compressed natural gas station in September, DOD did not dispute the $43 million figure then, and did not dispute it at the time the final report was issued in October, and we've only recently received the dispute of what the number is. But most importantly to this, putting aside the dispute on how much the compressed natural gas station actually cost, there are many other important questions that need to be addressed today. First of all, what happened to the money? All of it. Second, and regardless of cost for this compressed natural gas station, was there ever even a feasibility study conducted before money was invested on this project and other projects in Afghanistan? There are other troubling issues raised. Why did we spend $150 million on villas and security for no more than 5 to 10 TFBSO staff, a majority of the time, when they could have stayed on base? Why did we spend $55 million to facilitate an oil lender process that resulted in a Chinese company winning a contract that some have said, and in fact this Congress has even noted, could be used to exploit an estimated $1 trillion worth of Afghanistan mineral resources? What did DOD spend, and should DOD have spent money to develop carpet, jewelry, and ice cream businesses in Afghanistan? Why is it that after operating for years and spending millions of dollars, that most of TFBSO's extractive projects failed to fully meet project objectives? Finally, why weren't any of TFBSO's projects transferred to state or USAID so that we have continuity after having spent hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars? Every dollar the Pentagon wastes is a dollar that we don't have to restore military readiness and provide our troops what they need to protect themselves and our country. At a time of growing threats and constrained defense budget, when we have issues like this raised, and where we have serious questions about how taxpayer dollars have been spent. This is a very important inquiry for this committee and for the Senate because of our shared concern that we use every dollar to support our men and women in uniform and what they need to do to defend this nation. So today we will be asking these questions, I will be, and many more. And I look forward to this hearing, and I thank both of you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Sopko. I want to start with a basic question, Secretary McEwen, and that is, there were roughly $638 million dispersed over the life of the TFBSO task force. Can the DOD account for how each of those dollars were spent? Because as I look at the big picture here and a lot of the questions that have been raised on record keeping, can you fully account to the taxpayers as to each of how those $638 million were spent?
Senator Ayotte, we can give you a list of the contracts, and I believe we can tell you how all the money was dispersed broadly by sector. In answering the question about the CNG station, it points up to an inadequacy of the way they kept the books in the task force in terms of allocating the support costs to specific projects. They didn't do it on a project-by-project basis, which gives us the challenge of coming up with the right number for the CNG station. But it is our view, is my understanding, based on what I've been told and what I have seen in reviewing some of the records, that we know where all the money went. The money was contracted or dispersed through other parts of the department, either U.S. Army Central in Kuwait or other DOD entities such as the Washington Headquarters Services, or contracts which went through the Department of Interior, for example. So I think we have all the paper that shows how the money was dispersed.
And let me just ask you a basic question then, if we can account for each of these dollars, but I have serious questions given this even dispute listening to this that we can. But was it worth it? What do we get for the taxpayers? I mean, that's the fundamental question. What can we say in terms of deliverables for the mission of that is anything sustainable that we get to accomplish the purpose of economic development in Afghanistan?
So that's the big question, Senator, and it's the right one. As I said in my statement, I think it's a mixed record. I also think it's a little early to say. So, for example, some of the work the task force did and USAID has done in advising the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum on governance, competitive tenders, administration of a ministry, that kind of thing. The jury is still out on that. There are a number of tenders that I'm told are still in a decision-making process within the government. The Ghani government is looking closely at and reviewing a number of decisions by the Karzai government. And as I think even the task force's most recent audit on the extractives industry says, it's ultimately up to the government of Afghanistan to carry the ball forward.
So did we keep metrics or anything like this for this task force?
I have not seen in all the materials I have reviewed
And is Mr.
specific metrics.
Is Mr. Sopko right when he said, using the gas station as an example, that there was no feasibility study?
I can't dispute that, Senator. We have not found in our search of the records what we would understand to be a feasibility study.
So there's a number of other issues, one that I wanted to ask about as well. Then I'm going to give Mr. Skopko an opportunity to comment on the questions that I've raised. But there was a letter that was written about $150 million that was spent on villas and security for TFBSO staff. That's 20% roughly of the money appropriated by Congress. Why couldn't they have stayed on base, and why was that decision made, and why is it justifiable for 20% of the money allocated for economic development for that purpose?
Senator, we owe Sigar an answer to that letter. We're still digging into the questions that he asked about the housing in Kabul and Herat and a couple of other places. What I understand was the reason for this. First, the task force was unique insofar as it was not under Chief of Mission authority. It was under the authority of the COM-ISAF. And they were somewhat entrepreneurial and took a little risk. And I think part of the reason for these housing was It was housing for staff coming from Washington in and out. I don't think a lot of people live there permanently. They were also used as offices, and they were used to show international businesses and executives that they could come to Afghanistan and do business.
So did we get any
and-
deliverable contracts of international businesses there because we spent $150 million on villas versus having them stay on base?
Senator, I can't tie a specific visit of an executive in one of these houses to a later investment. I wouldn't make that claim. The other thing I would say is the task force had their own private security to help them with security movements. They were not relying on the United States military for movements within the country by and large. There is a document that we've seen in the records that
Could they not have? I mean, they were a DOD task force. Could they not have asked the DOD and allocated some of the cost to support that?
I have not asked that question of CENTCOM, whether that would have been feasible at the time. I've seen one document where they signed an MOU between US 4A and the task force, giving as a contingency essentially for the task force to go on base or to be supported by the military. And it was signed by a 1- or 2-star general who wrote a note to the commander and said, I have a little misgivings about this because I'm not sure we're going to be able to support it completely.
Well, it just seems to me this is a DOD task force, $150 million. This is a very important question. And obviously, I think we as a committee would like to know why those decisions were made and what were the justifications and what return on investment we think we got from taking 20% of the appropriations to do that. I also wanted to follow up on the issue of the $55 million that was spent to facilitate an oil lender process that resulted essentially in the Chinese company winning a contract for extractives in Afghanistan. Do you think that was a wise use of taxpayer dollars?
Senator, what I know about that is the task force assisted the Afghan Ministry of Mines to offer a tender in accordance with general international principles, and the Chinese company competed and won. I can't tell you whether it was completely transparent and followed all the rules that we would expect in such a tender.
But stepping back for a second, my time is expiring, and then I know a number have questions, and I'm certainly going to want another round of questions. But I'm just trying to think, how do I tell the people of New Hampshire that we spent $55 million to facilitate an oil lender process so that we could pave the way for the Chinese to get a contract in Afghanistan, where apparently what's at issue is their ability to exploit an estimated $1 trillion worth of Afghanistan mineral resources. I'm laying it out there. Is this just your opinion? Do you think that was a wise use of our resources?
Senator, it's my opinion, the foundational work, as I said, of advising the Ministry of Mines may pay off in the future, and it's a lot of ifs. It will require some significant advances in security, significant advances in the rule of law, and significant embedding essentially a culture of openness and transparency in business practices. So I'm not going to tell you that we were happy about the Chinese government winning that tender. I don't think we tried to skew the results toward a non-Chinese firm. I don't know great detail about who else bid on the contract. We'll go back and try to look at that. But we go in, as I understood it, the task force was going in to try to advise them about how to do an international tender the way that international businessmen would expect. That was the objective.
Mr. Sopko, did you want to add on that?
Yes, Madam Chairman, if I could just add one thing about the Ministry of Mines, and I think, Senator Kane, this is also important to you, because I know you got a letter from a former minister. There has been a lot of analysis of that one tender, but there's been even more analysis done by Afghans themselves that during the time that that tenure was done, remember, this is the Karzai regime, the Ministry of Mines was the most corrupt ministry in a very corrupt government. It was so corrupt that USAID pulled back any direct assistance because they did a study on that, and it's a public study provided to all government agencies about how corrupt and incompetent that ministry was under the leadership of Minister Sharini. Now, what's important about this, and some of you know I'm a former prosecutor, but I also was an attorney and a partner for Aiken Gump, represented a lot of Fortune 100 firms. And one thing you know when you deal with corporate America, American businesses know their customers, they know where they're going to be selling the products, and they know what the bottom line is. If you look at TFBSO and apply just reason and common sense, what we are talking about is here, the Department of Defense still doesn't know who their clients were and what was the bottom line cost for all of this. And so I would caution, before we have this pie in the sky that this is all going to come to fruition, we understand what we're dealing with. And I think that's the big picture question about TFBSO. They didn't know where they were working.
So I wanted to ask, as I looked at sort of the course of information here, one of the things that troubled me was that SIGAR either provided draft reports to DOD for comment or requested TFBSO information in March of 2015, May of 2015, June of 2015, October of 2015, and of course, this month again. And in each instance, the OSD or you, Mr. Secretary McKeown, responded by saying that the task force was shut down and that you could not answer questions about TFBSO because the task force was shut down. Now, this task force shut down in May of 2015. You yourself, this task force reported to 9 months prior to it shutting down. And as I understand it, as soon as June of 2015, Dr. Catalino, who had a significant role in the task force, was actually working at DOD, I think, in OSD itself. Yet the repeated answer to the SIGAR's question was, listen, we can't answer your questions because the task force is shut down. So to follow up on what Senator McCaskill asked, I mean, if that's the case, how are we ever going to have oversight on any task force? So can you explain to me why that was the answer each time? The other issue is that, as I understand it, there were also military personnel who had assisted in the task force and had roles in the task force that were still serving, that could have been made available as well, and yet the answer was the same each time. Why would we answer in such a way instead of just trying to get to the bottom of answering their questions?
Senator, if I could go back to about a year ago this time during the administrative shutdown period from January to March, this task force and Mr. Catalino responded to a fairly voluminous information request from SIGAR and many of, I know Mr. Catalino was interviewed. And so after the task force staff dispersed and were gone from the roles of the department, we thought we had set up SIGAR for a way of success to do its review. We provided access to the record. We'd already provided this information on several disks, and we'd provided a list of the former employees of the task force from 2010 to 2014. So as
Can I ask you a question? When you provided the list of the employees on the task force, did you include on that list current members who are serving in the military?
Ma'am, I've not seen the list. I looked at a letter that was written from Mr. Catalino to SIGAR setting forth what it was we provided. I've not seen the list of personnel, so I can't tell you what level of detail about their assignments are.
Well, I'll certainly want to come back to that, but I think Mr. Sopko had a comment on this issue. I mean, you've had obviously your history and experience in doing these types of investigations. This struck you as unusual, as I understand it.
Extremely unusual. As I said, my deputy was in GAO for nearly 40 years, and I did this for almost 20 years on the Hill, and I've never heard of an organization. It'd be like Harry Truman in 1945 saying, I can't answer any questions about dropping the bomb. The war's over. You know, we've shut down. This organization was not a DFAC out in Omaha. This was an organization that reported to the Secretary of Defense. It was the premier organization on developing the economy in Afghanistan by the Department of Defense. It was an organization that reported to my good colleague here for 7 months. And then all of a sudden, it's like, poof, amnesia. It's not just access to individuals. They have a responsibility to answer some of the questions. It's not our responsibility to track down, and again, I have no subpoena authority, once they retire or once they leave the military, like Mr. Catalino. We interviewed him when he was working for TFBSO. He then left. Ironically, he was recruited in May and June by Mr. McEwen's deputy COO, who in that June 30th meeting, where his deputy COO had just hired back Mr. Catalino, he makes the statement in front of everybody, including multiple staff members, that I know of no one in the department who can answer any of your questions.
So you're told no one in the department in this meeting can answer your questions, yet at the time, they've recruited or already hired?
They had already hired.
Dr.
We interviewed
Catalino.
Mr. Catalino, and he told us he had been hired 10 days before that meeting by the Deputy Chief Operating Officer, Mr. Steve Schlein. Now, I have no idea. Maybe Mr. Catalino is mistaken. It's very easy to pull out his hiring documents. We know he knows Mr. Schlein. I don't know why Mr. Schlein then makes a pronouncement to us at this June 30th meeting after he hires back Catalino that I don't know anybody in the department who can answer your questions. Now, that is what I'm saying is an enigma. And I've never faced this before in my dealings with the Department of Defense, both as a congressional staffer as well as a private attorney. I've never heard of this before.
This raises also the reason I wanted to ask whether when you provided the list of employees, whether you provided the names also of currently serving military, members of our military, is because we have someone in the audience that I want to thank who is here, who's given me, I think, permission to recognize him, and that is Colonel Hope, who is here with his wife. And Colonel Hope actually was assigned to the TFBSO task force and served as Director of Operations of TFBSO from August of 2014 until March of 2015. Mr. Sopko, I want to ask you, is this someone that you spoke to in this investigation, Colonel Hope?
We normally don't say who we've spoken to, but in this case, since I believe Colonel Hope has already mentioned it, he's given us, yes, he has been very helpful to us, and we are dealing with him and have followed up on some of his allegations.
And so,
Senator, can I respond briefly to what
Yes.
Mr. Sopko just said about the June 30 meeting? I don't know what was said. I was not at the meeting. We're not trying to hide Mr. Catalino. We've made him available. We'll make him available again. If Mr. Schlein made a mistake about the fact that Mr. Catalino had already started, that's on us. We're accountable for that. But the irony is, if he was not in the department, as Mr. Sopko has said, he would be free to decline to talk to SIGAR because of the lack of subpoena power for testimonial purposes. So he's available to SIGAR, as are other former employees who are in the department.
So I want to raise the issue of Colonel Hope's service, which we're grateful for, because I think it's very important as I look at the role that he played on this task force. When he was assigned to this task force, he started to raise issues immediately of deep concern about, there's a long list of things that he raised about the lack of operation and financial oversight, about the lack of metrics or analysis to measure success, that essentially the oversight was lacking, no accounting of costs, expenditures, or money transfers, and serious questions about excessive travel, both from security and financial standpoint. I mean, this is a laundry list that TFBSO had no property book or no property book officer over the lifetime of its existence. And he claims, and I have to say I'm very troubled as I see this whole course of record, that that not only him but the entire Afghanistan military team was subjected to and continues to be subjected to retribution and retaliation after their return from the task force, and after they, he in particular raised issues about this task force. And as I understand it, when the list of employees was given to SIGAR, the people like Colonel Hope were not listed on that list, and they obviously would have knowledge as current serving members of our military that were involved in important roles in this task force. And that raised a flag for him that caused him to not only bring information to the attention of SIGAR, but also, as a result of him raising this, he had to file a retribution complaint with the Inspector General's office of the department, and he was given a review that was different than 4 other reviews he had received from very, very respected and senior members of our military, from you, Secretary McEwen, is one that, any member of our military would view as a career ender. And as a result, not only was this review one where it should have been issued in March and then wasn't issued till December in violation of existing DOD policy, but essentially, he raised all these issues about TFBSO, and now, again, as someone who I would describe as doing the right thing as a whistleblower, who has really nothing to gain, and at this point, obviously, I am concerned about having the subject of retribution, is now in a position where this has been harmful to his military career. So I guess my question to you, Secretary McEwen, is, as Colonel Hope Senior Rater, what was it that in his role, why was his evaluation so late? Why weren't his concerns taken seriously? As I understand it, he sent to you an after-action report by email in 2015. In fact, he's told me that he sent it actually in, I believe, March of 2015. He never received a response from you by email. And so I guess what worries me is I hear this course of conduct where SIGAR asks a series of questions, and they're told, well, the task force ended, and no one can answer your questions right now. We had questions as a committee. I pushed to have this hearing, and we didn't get the new numbers on the gas station till, even though you had the draft report in September, you had the final report in October, you had follow-up written letter in December on this issue. We don't get the numbers till the night before, and I have to ask, what's going on here? This worries me. Can you address Colonel Hope? Can you address that we shouldn't be concerned that somehow this is being covered up? Because all this course of conduct raises this flag that very much concerns me as to why this is not being played in a way that we would normally see this type of investigation, the questions being answered and answered not without having to call a hearing on it, but immediately.
Senator Ayotte, let me first address the issue of Colonel Hope. He was the Director of Operations in the Kabul office starting, I believe, in September of 2014 until the end of the task force's operation. He asked me probably about a year ago this time to be a senior rater because I was the next person above Mr. Catalino. And he emailed me and asked me to do that and asked to come see me so I could put a name with a face, and I did meet with him last January. His OER didn't come to me until September. I can't account for the delay.
What does an OER stand for?
I'm sorry, sir, ma'am. Officer Evaluation Report. His OER came to me in September, and I filled it out. Let me look at the dates that I have here. It was signed by Mr. Catalino on the 2nd of September. I signed it on the 11th of September. At that time, I'm a little embarrassed to say this. When I filled out the form, in filling out one of the one part of the form, I didn't completely fill it out. But the computer program that the Army has for its personnel allowed me to hit the signature box even though I hadn't completed the forms. Now, you know, with a lot of merchants or government officials, if you're going, government websites, if you go through, if you don't fill out the key one, that won't let you sign it and hit submit. But this one did. That's on me, it's my fault, I'm not blaming the Army system, but that's what happened. When it was called to our attention that it had not been completed, it was completed in mid-November, on November 19th by Mr. Catalino, and I signed it also the same day. And then the system pushed it to Colonel Hope. That's my understanding of how it works based on an 06 Army colonel who works in our front office. Our records show that Colonel Hope signed it on 15 December. I read the after-action report only in the last month or so. If Colonel Hope emailed it to me last March, I will go back and look at my records. I don't remember seeing it at that time or reading it at that time. As to what the report says, it says some of the things you said about the lack of a property book and property accountability, and Colonel Hope recites how he and his colleagues sought to remedy that. I don't recall that the report says some of the other things you said about travel abuse, but I would unequivocally deny that the rating he received had anything to do with that report. As to the rating he received, I don't feel that it's my place to discuss that in this open hearing. As to the other issue you raised, Senator, about trying to answer SIGAR's questions, I think I tried to answer it earlier, but I will do it again, which is, I know it may sound odd that we didn't have the expertise to dig through these records and understand them, but other than Mr. Catalino, we really had no one who had familiarity with these records. He was not steeped in the energy project. It was started before his time as deputy director. I talked to him about it, about his knowledge about it. It wasn't deep. We have spent a lot of time in the last couple of months by grabbing staff from other projects to try to help sort through these records. The controller that Mr. Sopko referred to earlier is not a DOD. He's not in Mr. McCord's part of the organization. He's the controller for the Defense Security Cooperation Agency who reports to the Undersecretary for Policy. I asked him to take a few days, sift through these records, and see if he could make sense of the CNG project as somebody who understands DOD financial practices. And the statements I make in my written testimony are derived directly from what he told me. So we have conveyed that, and we've made him available to SIGAR to explain his analysis. So what I'm trying to say, ma'am, is, as I've said before, because of the unique nature of this task force and because we shut it down and chose not to keep legacy employees around, it's been a challenge for us to go back and try to reconstruct these records. But we are doing that now in response to your requests, in response to SIGAR's requests. I'm trying to see if we can find a former employee of the task force to come work on a temporary basis to assist us. So we will work in good faith to try to respond to this request. But they had 150, 200 employees, a lot from the business sector. They're all gone. And to try to recreate what happened 5 and 6 years ago is going to be a very hard challenge for us. We welcome the audit that you and the other senators have asked for. As I said, Mr. Lumpkin, when he was performing the duties of the Undersecretary in April of 2014, asked the DOD IG to perform a full audit. I requested a financial audit at the end of 2014, which Washington Headquarters Services paid for. And I think we've provided that to you, but if we haven't, we will. So we are an open book on these records. SIGAR has them. If there are other records that he thinks are out there that we have not provided, we will look. We're not trying to hide anything. I think it's very useful to find out what happened, but it's going to be hard for us to recreate some of this history with all the task force employees gone, except for a handful of people who might still be in the department.
Just so I can go finish up this circle on Colonel Hope, because I'm very appreciative of his service. I want to ask Mr. Sopko, do you know generally when Colonel Hope started speaking, at least to SIGAR, about this concerns about TFDSO?
Offhand, I don't. I would have to check with the staff.
Could you get that for me for the record?
Absolutely.
I'd appreciate it.
Senator, if I could say one more thing about Colonel Hope. I didn't witness his work firsthand. I've read his report. It's my understanding he did perform a critical function in Kabul. When I saw him here today before you arrived, I apologize to him for the delay in the OER. So I do apologize publicly for the delay. I deny and believe to my core there was no retaliation.
Well, I think that the concern is also when Colonel Hopes was rated by General Odierno, who many of us know has a distinguished record of service. He called him a top 1% officer and one of the top 20 of the 100 colonels he had served with his 40-plus years in the Army. So I just want to make sure that that's in the record, because having certainly had the opportunity to know General Odierno, we know he's one of the finest generals to serve our nation. And so this issue does raise the flag for me, and I want to make sure that every member of our military or our civilian workforce understands that they can fully come forward with any issue that they have or concern about not only how taxpayer dollars are spent, but also how the business of the government is conducted in a way that they know that they won't face any potential for retribution. I want to follow up on a couple of specific issues to make sure that this committee, as we get information about the activities of TFBSO, in follow-up not only to Senator Round's questions, in addition to the goats and the carpet, and I would like to make sure that we get travel records of where people traveled for the carpet industry, to the purchase and shipment of the goats, but also I would like to have the same type of information about the jewelry manufacturing initiative that we've been given information that TFBSO traveled to India and other locations as part of that. I don't know if you have information on that today, but I would like to understand that on the jewelry initiative, and also the ice cream initiative that apparently TFBSO had a Herat ice cream project run out of the villa in Herat, Afghanistan, and a former TFBSO employee says this initiative was one of the primary reasons that they had a villa or safe house established in Herat. So I would like to understand, as we get the answer on the villa issue, the information about the ice cream initiative, the jewelry initiative, the goat initiative, and and the carpeting initiative, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Kane. So that's important. And one of the issues that, as I heard you talking, Secretary McEwen, about the challenges of not having the employees, when we had the wind down of the task force, did it not occur to anyone at that point that the Congress would want to have a full accounting of how the taxpayer dollars were spent and whether we actually got any return on the investment?
It did, Senator. That's why we sought Mr. Lumpkin asked for the Inspector General to conduct an audit. That's why I asked for the financial audit. It's why we contracted with the RAND Corporation to help us with the lessons learned examination.
But that RAND report doesn't, by its own admission, is not an audit and doesn't fully account for how dollars were spent and also a cost-benefit analysis of those dollars.
That's correct. It's a general impressionistic review based on interviews of whether projects were meritorious and succeeded. We don't have an audit ability in OSD policy. We asked the IG to do it. He declined based on resources and wanting to work on current projects rather than backward looking. I only know that from his letter and from, this is the former IG, Mr. Reimer. He's now left the department. I spoke to him briefly. That's why I asked for the financial audit, which WHS contracted for, which I believe you have. We support if SIGAR wants to undertake a full audit at your request or the committee's request. We have no objection to that.
I would like to request that audit. I think the members of the committee would like to see that, and obviously we would hope that you would fully cooperate in getting whatever information is needed so that the SIGAR could conduct a full audit so that we could account for not only the initiatives that we talked about today, but we were able to account for each of the dollars that are expended and how they were expended in this task force. I do have to ask, though, on the gas station issue, why it took so long for DOD. I mean, when there was a draft report in September, when there was the final report in October, where there were issues raised even in December in a follow-up letter about the villas that again reiterated the $43 million number for the gas station. In each of those instances, DOD did not challenge the number, and I'm just curious why it took, basically the night before this hearing, or a day before this hearing, for that to come forward and for you to then challenge the number. I'm not disputing of whether the number's right or wrong on that. I just am trying to understand what took so long.
Well, as I said, Senator, we've been borrowing staff from other functions to try to answer the inquiries over the last few months on this issue and trying to drill down on the data and the records. And I can't remember when the controller from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency came up with his analysis. We knew you were planning this hearing, so I think it was before yesterday. We certainly had some of this information, and we're preparing to provide it to the
It
committee.
would have at least been helpful to say to SIGAR, we think there's a huge problem with this number, and we're going to have a financial analysis done of it, so.
Senator, if I could interject and maybe help Mr. McEwen, we spoke to that comptroller, as I told you, we just got his name. We've been asking Mr. McEwen for his name and contact information since December. He actually told us that he started his review on November 17th and finished it on November 20th. And like yourself, he finished it on November 20th. It would have been useful if we had gotten a copy of it before last night. We still don't have a copy of his final report. We've just interviewed him.
But again, as I understand your testimony, Mr. Sopko, even that individual can't fully answer the question about the number because of the lack of record keeping.
You're absolutely correct, Senator. I mean, he basically said that the analysis underlying the overhead number is probably incorrect, but due to poor record keeping, there is no way to get a better number. And again, I reiterate that under GAGAS, under SIGI standards, we are required to get the best number. So therefore, he basically makes our case that the number we gave, which came from DOD again, it was the best number. He called his gut feeling, he indicated it's probably less, but he stated that there's no fidelity in the overhead numbers. It would be impossible to arrive at a more accurate estimate of the total overhead cost for CNG. I think this is critical, not because of the number. The gas station number is really not that important. This goes back to the underlying problems that I think the senators have pointed out, and that is there's poor planning, poor management, and poor coordination at TFBSO. They can't even get their overhead numbers right. No wonder we don't know how much money was spent on goats or if the goats were even eaten or not. We don't know. This is so poorly managed. And that's a problem that was identified by the General Accounting Office years ago when they first did their first audit, and we've been identifying that since then.
And that brings me to my final question, which is, there was the 2011 GAO report based on what happened with TFBSO in in Iraq, before the decision was made to transition to Afghanistan. And it strikes me as if you look at what's in that GAO recommendations, that the lessons learned from Iraq, none of which were taken into account as this transition to Afghanistan. In fact, I don't think that Mr. Brinkley, could account for costs or feasibility or, and in fact, projects seem to have been approved without knowing what they would cost. And these are all things that came, as you look at the GAO report, about how you should establish project criteria, metrics, monitoring. These were all lessons taken from Iraq, and also from the CSIS report, similar lessons. All that information, it doesn't appear to me, Secretary McEwen, that any of that was considered or addressed based on the lessons we learned in Iraq as this task force undertook its activities in Afghanistan. Would you disagree with me on that?
I wasn't there at the time, Senator, and based on the record I have seen, I'm not sure I can disagree. What I would say is Mr. Brinkley left in the summer of 2011 and a lot of senior people left with him. And there was a gap before there was a new director hired. In 2012, there was an acting director. And I think they probably had to reinvent the wheel a little bit. They did have, when they first went into Afghanistan, it's my understanding they asked McKinsey and Company to do an analysis of what sectors might be productive in terms of economic generation. And they focused on a few set of issues, including particularly the extractives industry, minerals and natural and fossil fuels. We have not found this review or study. In my experience with McKinsey, it's a 10-page slide deck, so I'm not sure it's going to answer many questions anyway, but I'm told that the McKinsey work helped to direct and guide the focus of the task force. And I think in terms of the minerals resources that Afghanistan has, as I said earlier, there's a lot of ifs here. If you had security, if you had strong companies, if you had open and non-corrupt government, there's a lot of potential there for Afghanistan to benefit from its natural resources. There's a lot of countries in the world who have as many natural resources as Afghanistan, and they've not managed them well. Corrupt governments, they haven't shared prosperity with all. So it's a pretty big challenge, even in the absence of a war. And so I don't think we're going to see whatever useful work was done by the task force in USAID to lay the foundation with the government of Afghanistan. I'm not sure we're going to see a payoff anytime soon from that, if indeed there ever is a payoff.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems when we look at $800 million of taxpayer dollars and we can't show any metrics or deliverables. I think that's where my constituents certainly become upset about how we're spending their dollars. I would just end with, how can we make sure that this doesn't happen again? And I think we've heard today that this is not, DOD is not the best place for this type of work, but unfortunately, as we look at what we do going forward, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And how do we make sure that you have what you need, Mr. Sopko, to properly conduct oversight and to make sure that the Inspector General's office has the teeth that it needs to get us the information we need to ensure that we are doing our job on oversight for the taxpayers of this country?
Senator, I think you can make certain this doesn't happen again by having hearings like this. Oversight is important. Congressional oversight, and I'm a little biased having spent 25 years doing it for Sam Nunn, Carl Levin, and John Dingell, among others, and Warren Rudman from your state.
But
You need oversight.
Really good people.
I learned on the best. It's important. It has to be done. And I can tell you, I'm usually not shy. If there's one thing for expressing my concerns about issues. And one of the reasons why I'm not shy is because I realize, and I learned from those senators, that you sometimes have to publicize an event to reach over the heads of the people who are trying to protect their bosses from hearing bad news. And I say, senators, you've already done quite a bit. By announcing this hearing, for the first time, we have access to records. We have a list of names. We have, for the first time in years, Mr. McEwen's shop is actually looking at some of those numbers. I think you have a success already. Now, there's many more miles to go on this, but that is the importance of congressional oversight. Your hearing itself has started the ball rolling in the right direction, and I think with Secretary McKeon and myself working together in this, we can help give you more answers to these questions.
Senator, may I respond? I think I've said it a few times, but I have to rebut what Mr. Sopko just said. He had access to records and he had the names of employees all of last year. The point I would make in response to your question is we welcome oversight from the IG or from SIGAR. It's unfortunate that some of this oversight of the task force's work didn't come earlier so that we could have had course corrections. We're now doing a retrospective history, which is still useful in its own right. But it's going to be a challenge, I wish to underscore, for us to, without the people who were there, to recreate what happened, but we will do our best to respond.
Appreciate that. I want to thank both of you for testifying today, and I would just say that we had the lessons learned from the CSIS report and the GAO report from 2011. We just have to stop repeating these lessons over and over again. And it is my hope, and I think the point that Senator McCaskill made today, that this is not the first instance where we've seen big issues with how taxpayer dollars have been spent and wasted. And so we need to take the work that has been done and take it to heart and actually apply the lessons from it. And I hope that we will. But this committee still does expect to be able to account to the people of this country for how this money was spent. So I hope that every effort will be made to do that. Thank you.